Let's look at some swords with some very special guests, Todd and Scal.
Hi.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and I'm with my two friends Todd and Scal, and obviously you know who they are. I'm going to link both their channels down below just in case by some weird circumstance you don't know who they are. But anyway, massive channels, go and check them out. And today I thought we're all together filming various things, and so I thought it'd be a great opportunity for me to bring down some genuine antique swords that we can look at from different perspectives. You're used to hearing about them from my perspective as antique dealer and fencing person, whatever I am, but what would Scal think about these swords and observations, and what would Todd think about them perhaps from the view of a maker and someone who actually makes these sorts of things. So we're going to move forward through history. This video is going to be in two parts, so we're going to start off in the 17th century. Okay, so I have two rapiers here. Now regular viewers of my channel will probably recognize these rapiers. This is an English rapier from about 1620 to 1640, and this is a Spanish rapier from about 1650 to probably about 1680. So first up, let's have a look at the earlier one. Let's have a look at the English rapier. So I've handed that to Todd. So what are your observations about this?
The workmanship on the guard, it is all I think it's hard to say really. It's not cast because it can't be cast at this period in steel, but it's pretty crudely chiseled. It's not a fantastic bit of workmanship, really. So it looks. Sorry, are you selling this?
No, that's actually in my collection.
Now it's fair to say I think some of it has been rubbed away through the years.
Yes.
But essentially, when you're looking at it like that, it looks great. It absolutely looks great. When it's being swung towards you, poked towards you, you're not going to notice any of the decoration anyway. But if you get up really close, it's not fantastic quality work. The pommel, I suspect, has rusted a lot and then been cleaned back, so I can't even comment on that. The guard less so. Now the grip is really interesting, of course, because it's now a wire-bound grip, which has been pressed into this diamond pattern underneath. And I have to be honest and say, I don't know how to do that.
Really?
No, I really don't. I've never done a wire-bound grip like that. Every time I've tried, I haven't got it right, so I need to go and talk to one of the masters
Interesting.
That are still doing that. So what I would say is that's quite complex.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely this formed spiral wire-bound grip stuff is absolutely characteristic of the period.
Yeah.
And I think probably what happened is somebody worked out how to do it because it wasn't around before about 1550.
Yeah.
Somebody worked out how to do it, and then it just became the thing that everybody had to have. But other than that, I mean, it's just a lovely piece. Roughly speaking, how much something like would that be worth?
Difficult to value, but you're looking at about £2,000 in that condition. If it was in better condition, 2.5, 3.
Yeah, but I mean, for a 400-year-old.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really good money.
Yeah, and I mean, this is very much something that could have been carried during the English Civil War, and in fact, when you look at the number of people who were engaged in the English Civil War, which was actually a fairly large percentage of the population, it was a more bloody war than I think a lot of people realise. There's a very good chance that this was worn at least during the English Civil War, and it's interesting that you flex it there. So
gently.
Well, yeah, but. A lot of people are under the misapprehension or misunderstanding that historical steels can't be as springy as modern steels, and maybe in literal terms that might be true. They can't be as springy, but you certainly, when you pick up medieval swords or Renaissance swords, they have springy blades. They are essentially spring steel.
And then we've got an engraving down the fuller here, Thomas something.
Yeah.
Maker, owner?
I'm not sure, but it's probably a Spanish blade, and Spanish blades were very highly prized at this time, but mounted on a distinctly English style hilt.
But then, so looking at the blade form here, we've got maybe about 8 millimetres, 8.5 millimetres at the hilt.
Yeah.
And it very rapidly drops. So it's almost like I'm not quite sure what the purpose of that is, but it rapidly drops to that point where it's dropped into under 6 mil. Why quite that would make the difference, I don't know.
I think it gives quite a lot of stability. So with replicas that we fence with, when they don't have that thickness at the base, they always feel wobbly.
Flexing through the handle.
Yeah. So when you're binding against an opponent's blade, I guess it means that really only this portion of the blade is liable to flex, and you won't feel any of the flex up here.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think structurally, as a maker, I think I couldn't see a difference. The weight difference would be very little. 6mm, if it was 6mm, wouldn't be flexing through. So I don't know. There's a reason they've done it, but it's interesting that drop down and taper is so rapid. But Scal, what do you make of it?
Let's see. First off, English rapier. George Silver would rotate in his grave. Pokey one? No.
So interesting to note that this is a cut and thrust blade. So although it's not broad, it's very clearly designed in such a way that it's sacrificed some stiffness to still have some cutting capacity.
Yes, it's relatively thin for a rapier.
Yeah, but you wouldn't want to, a good full arm, sort of full motion cut to the thigh from that. You wouldn't want that.
It wouldn't be fine, no, definitely
on
not.
the thigh or the face or the hand. It would do enough damage to change the fight.
Yeah, I mean, like you already said, Todd, the craftsmanship, I mean, you can definitely say some things about that. Like, for example, symmetry, they didn't care as much for. I mean, that's a general thing that we see with a lot of swords from the time, or other artifacts, where they just didn't value symmetry quite the way we do, so they didn't see the need to make everything perfectly even.
It's always intrigued me that with some things in the medieval world, they just didn't care at all. I mean, I'm thinking back to those braces on the Mary Rose, where I tried to make one, if you like, as bad as some of the ones in the book. It's physically not possible to make them that badly.
One of my favourite examples is one of the swords of Emperor Maximilian in Vienna, which I got to handle. And what amazed me was that one of the quillons is visibly longer than the other one. You know, the crossguard on the Emperor of the Holy Roman Emperor. You know, the Holy Roman Emperor's sword is wonky, which I think we have a tendency in the modern engineered factory, world to think more like graphic designers, rather than they thought more from a fine art kind of point of view of you look at a Van Gogh and it's it's a lot of oil paint slapped on a thing, but the end result looks amazing. And I think that's more of the mindset of what we should think about when we look at these things. But personally, as an amateur tinkerer and restorer rather than maker, I look at that guard and I think of the enormous amount of hours that would have gone into that, because it's steel. So if we were to cast that in modern stainless steel or brass or whatever, you'd model it on a computer, or you 3D print it, but you could make a mold for it and cast out loads of them. But making each one of those by hand, filing, chiseling, it's and I think there is a lot of work. Yeah, and so initially I imagine, and also all of these junctions must have been forge welded together as well.
They're all welded on.
So,
but I mean, if we look at the fretwork here, for instance, it is quite fine. I mean, it's each of those holes would have had to start with a punch through and then filing, and their files, of course, weren't that great back then. So, that's a lot of work. This is all hand chiseling again. Hammer and little chisel, no air engravers. So it is a lot of work. But it doesn't mean that it's very, very high quality. Yeah. That's the thing. You've got to deliver the image. You've got to deliver what people are expecting to see, which is a nice fancy hilt. Yeah. But the difference between a top grade bit of engraving and this might be 4, 5, 8 times the length of time.
Sure. Yeah.
And actually, as a modern maker, that's one of the things which is always quite interesting. Is I was talking about it actually the other day on one of the Patreon films I did, where there's a dagger I do. And the original has a black handle, and the bottom line is it's got brass castings, bronze castings that fit into that handle. You carve it, you make the things fit, it's fine. But then the whole thing's bonded on with pitch, and because the handle's black, any slight discrepancies get hidden. The pitch fills it, you don't see it. Yeah. You make exactly the same dagger with a white handle or a light wood handle, and suddenly it's 3 times, 4 times the amount of work to carve exactly the same thing. And it's a very difficult thing to explain to a customer. Is these two things look exactly the same. They are exactly the same, except this one is in boxwood and this one is in ebony. And the ebony one costs you £500 less than the boxwood.
Yeah,
You know.
wow. So, staying on the theme of rapier.
Before we
Yeah.
move on to the next one, I haven't talked about the handling yet.
Oh yeah,
It's-
well, so funny. So hold that thought,
Okay.
because I was going to ask you about the handling with both of these. So if we put that
I
one
see.
down for a second, that's
Let's
why I
put
brought
that
both of them
down.
out at the same time. So this is a Spanish rapier. It's a little bit later than that one. It is of a style which is completely contemporary with this. You'll see that it's got a very different overall silhouette. So the characteristic features of the Spanish rapier in this case is it has a shorter grip and a smaller pommel. That's because it's held in a different way. We'll talk about that in a second. But also the Spanish one has absolutely huge quillons, massive long crossguard. And again, it's to do with the way that they're used. The English rapier has little curly quillons, nothing much to speak about. But they do fundamentally both have cups or bowls, but the Spanish one is bigger than the English one. Again, comes down to how they're used. Right, so let's have a look. Now I should also mention the English rapier was made in smaller numbers, probably relatively high cost. These were churned out in vast numbers in places like Toledo and Spain, and they were for equipping common soldiers. So that's an officer's weapon, this is a common soldier's weapon.
So again, if we compare the two here, obviously this one is decorated all over,
Yeah.
and that has a great cost, as discussed. This one, the back face has no decoration at all. It's just got a, you know, a fairly roughly engraved in line around it, borderline. Then you have the decoration on the front here, which is etched. So again, that is a relatively quick process. Forge welding on here, you know, nobody's pretending that it hasn't happened. And again, this one's actually partially given up here. But all the forge welding is done, so it's a case of just working your way through the bars, tapping them on as you go.
Yeah.
Once the thing's finished, you put your mask down and you etch it up. So you end up with something that looks, you know, fairly decorative, but is actually a mass production technique. You know, this is the mass-produced goods of the 17th century. That's it. I mean, where you have lines like this, where you have intersecting bars, where they've filed them down slightly to clean them up from the weld.
Yeah.
That's always interesting when you're doing complex hilts, because you have to be able to get your file in there. And so as soon as you are filing into an area where there is something right behind it, if you're making it like that, and this is something I struggle with, if you can't clean the joint, there's something wrong with the joint alignment.
Okay.
Because they would have got in to clean the joints. Not brilliantly. And again, you can see this here, and this is it's not shoddy work, it's just normal medieval work or Renaissance work.
Yeah.
Is you kind of clean it up, you kind of give the impression that you want to give, and then you go done.
Yeah. Move on to the next one. Yeah. And an interesting thing from a manufacturing point of view, particularly with Spanish swords, is Spanish blades. So that you could say that Toledo in Spain and Solingen in Germany was so famous for churning out good quality blades that even very often anyway, even their basic quality swords like this one have good blades on them. And often what you'll find is what's a basic quality Spanish blade on a really good quality English or French hilt, because outside of Spain they didn't have so much easy access, affordable access to really good quality blades. So if they imported a batch of 100 blades in from Toledo or Solingen, they'd be mounted up with expensive hilts. Whereas in Spain, because they had plentiful supply of these really good quality blades that they were churning out, you'll find them on basically all the standard swords have got really good blades on them. So this is actually, although it's a basic quality rapier, that is actually a really good quality, nicely made blade. And it does have a maker's name in the fuller, but unfortunately due to the pitting from age, you can't quite read who it's made by, but there were a number of well-known makers in Toledo, and it doesn't mean that they were literally making every blade. It probably means that it was their workshop and they sort of signed off on the work. So very different type of rapier, similar size. The English one's actually slightly longer, but they come in sometimes they're a bit longer, sometimes they're a bit shorter, sometimes a bit wider, sometimes a bit slimmer. This is a double-edged blade, but to me that is a much more thrust-centric blade. a cut with that, if it was sharpened up, is not going to have the same effect as a cut with this one, because this blade is a little bit thinner in that plane and wider in that plane. So that will go through a target, for example, tatami mat, if you want to brave it on the tatami mat, that will go through a mat more easily than that one would.
Yeah. I wouldn't expect either to cut terribly well just looking at that blade. I mean,
No. That's
with
not what
good
they-
edge alignment,
Yeah.
you need a lot of velocity to make it.
Yes.
But you can at least this, yeah.
And with these types of swords, getting the edge alignment perfect is critical, but also more difficult.
Yeah.
The broader the blade is, and if it's got a curve, it's easier to get the edge alignment and feel which direction the edge is pointing in. With these types of hilts and very narrow blades, it's more difficult to feel the correct edge alignment. And if you get the edge alignment slightly off, it will not cut at all.
And this one would be really difficult to get a sharp edge on. I mean, you pretty much can't.
Yeah.
It's so thick that
Exactly.
the angle is always going to be steep.
It's going to be a
So,
chisel type edge.
Even
yeah,
if you
yeah.
make it as sharp as you, like the apex, you can make as sharp as you want. You can make
Yeah.
It won't
it hair
last.
popping sharp. But it's just, it would have so much resistance
Yeah, yeah.
in the target. And I don't think it would even go through clothing.
But this is primarily a thrusting sword.
It is.
So
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, this one feels a little more solid than the other one. I'm
Yes.
not sure. Does this weigh a tiny bit more than the other one? Probably not much more.
it might do, but so I 100% agree. And so I think that's partly by virtue of the fact that this is a soldier's sword.
Mm-hmm.
These are made to be issued to a whole bunch of, let's call them musketeers, and to take out in the field and to go on campaign with. So this is something that has to survive campaign use, maybe on board ships fighting the English or the French or whoever, maybe taken to South America. A lot of these ended up in South America, places like Mexico, you know, so it has to survive that type of rough use, and probably centrally purchased and procured by the equivalent of a War Department or Ministry of Defence, whereas this, a completely personal purchase, and would stay with the gentleman who owned it, and he'd probably have 10 other swords for different occasions, you know. So really, although they're superficially, they're both rapiers, they're actually quite different swords for different people, for different purposes.
It's interesting that they even bothered with decorations at all for soldiers.
So I believe that is a crude version of a lion. Is it of Castile? I think it actually has a patriotic meaning. And so there's a whole family of these swords with these sort of shell hilts, and they all have this motif on the side. So it's a bit like having the St. George Cross on English equipment.
It just strikes me as an awfully labor-intensive sword to make, to equip a large number of people.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, at the time that was standard, but
even
it takes a little bit more longer than.
But prestige is even important when you're equipping your troops, because if you are the king of Spain and you are saying, right, I'm going to dispatch a squadron, a naval squadron with a bunch of marines on board to Chile to go and enforce some trade rights, you want them to look good. So you're going to make sure they've got the newest, flashiest uniform, and they've got new plumes on their helmets, and they've got some flashy rapiers.
But I mean, even by the time of the First World War, with the Pals battalions in England, you still had people who were raising battalions, you know, factory owners, local landowners, whatever it was, who were raising battalions and then issuing private issue kit to them.
Yeah.
You know, so I don't think it's surprising that they did that. And I mean, again, from a mass production point of view, you've got some, you know, very lowly paid guy who's just bending up these pieces against a jig.
Yeah.
They're just being bent up. They're handed on to the next guy, forge welds them on. It's not super complicated. Yes, it would be easier were it just a single thing, but then part of the utility of the rapier in the guard is lost through that, or you increase the weight to get the same strength, or whatever it might be. So yes, there are easier ways to make a sword, but it doesn't strike me as horribly labour intensive. From a modern point of view, again, it would be, because every single joint, every single surface, the market now requires that you don't have these great big dimples here. You don't have a slightly gapped forge weld. You've got another weld there where actually you can see here, actually that's probably a nice thing to film, in fact. I would absolutely be certain that what they've done with these two arms here, what they've done is they've split it off from the main body. They've bent it out, and then they've forge welded it onto this little tang here.
Yeah.
And you can see that weld
Yeah,
there.
you can see the weld.
Modern manufacture, totally unacceptable.
3 out of 10.
But it
Horrible
survived for a
finish.
few hundred years, so you know.
You know, and again, you can see here they've done it the same way. That little bar there was split off from this main one. You see how it's a bit thicker here and then thins down. I'd warrant that was split off from that one, and I'm guessing that this bar here was split at about that point, welded round. You can just about see on my finger there, it looks again like the weld is at about that point there.
But even then, like on the modern reproduction market, you rarely find details like this. They didn't have to do that. Like, this is not a functional part.
See, it's funny
of the
because
car,
when I'm reviewing replicas and looking at replicas, I always prefer something that looks more like this, even if it's a bit rough, if it looks properly handmade, if it looks correct to the period weapon. I prefer that than something which is cast. So, for example, in China, a lot of rapier hilts would be cast in stainless steel. They'd be modelled on a CAD, on AutoCAD on a computer, and then they'd be sent to a casting facility, cast in stainless steel, and they just don't look anything like the original thing. They're more perfect, and functionally you could even say they're better, but they don't look like the original thing, and that bothers me.
There's another maker's mark there.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah. I haven't actually researched the makers on either of these swords, which I will do at some point. So, to finish off with the rapiers before we move on to another sword, what would you both say about the ergonomics and handling of these two swords and what it tells you about how they're used? Because they are actually quite distinct from each other.
Now I'm feeling with this one that if you put your finger through the ring there,
Yeah.
you're too tight into the guard.
Yes, and it's cutting into the back of your hand there. Yeah.
And so my immediate go-to is that is not nice, and that gives you a better clearance there. That would be my opinion. Yeah, whereas that absolutely works. And even just subtle things with this one, like because the leverage, the weight comes on the back of that finger if you're not grasping it properly. They've made the back of the guard here super wide.
Yeah. To spread the wider than on this side. Yeah.
And flat, not rounded, which might have been the obvious go-to.
Yeah.
Which of course would still peak in a pressure point.
Skal, what are you feeling?
I feel like from a duelist perspective, this is quite nice.
Yeah.
Because they're both light and nimble. Like this is not an issue with either of them. But this just even more so. Like the tip control is absolutely effortless. You can make really nice tight circles, which is something that on the battlefield soldiers wouldn't do all the fancy disengage, and it would be a little bit more basic.
People will ask at this point what the weights of these two rapiers are. I actually don't know off the top of my head. I'll weigh them at home and I'll put it on screen, but from memory they're both about 1,000 grams. They're both, I think that one is actually more like 900.
I would have guessed maybe even 800.
Yeah, it's pretty light, that one. Yeah. And that's particularly light for a rapier as well. So a lot of rapiers are quite heavy, but that is a particularly light one.
That's what I always thought, sort of right at the beginning, that rapiers were feather light. Yeah, so at the beginning of doing any of this stuff, I always thought the rapiers were really quite light things, feather light, but a lot of them actually aren't.
Some of them are super heavy, but some of them are light. I mean, that one's only, I think, about 900 grams, which is pretty light for a sword of that length anyway. It's about a 40-inch blade. So
what's the date on this one?
That's about 1630.
Okay.
It's probably slightly pre the English Civil War.
Yeah. So we haven't really drifted towards small swords yet.
No, but what's interesting is, although the small sword, and we're going to talk about, that's a bit of a spoiler there, we're going to talk about small swords in a second.
I didn't even know.
The ultimate sword.
Although it's seen as a French sword, in France, the Netherlands, or let's say the Low Countries, Belgium as well, and England, and parts of Scandinavia, there was a shift in rapier design that was already moving towards the small sword. So although this is a true rapier, it's not hugely removed from swords that we call transitional rapiers, which are really moving in the direction of small swords. But we're going to look at a small sword in a second, which Todd correctly guessed. So one thing I would just say, which I don't think either of you touched on, is what you do with the finger. So there's some debate amongst rapier treatises as to how you hold a sword, and in fact there's a whole plethora of different ways you can hold the sword. The most typical is to put one finger over the quillon, like you would with the side sword, okay? But you don't put the entire finger through, which was what you were finding was uncomfortable with this one. You really only put the tip through, just the tip, Todd, okay? So just the tip in there, and you put the tip in and then have the rest of the hand quite near the back, and you'll notice if you do that, then the guard's miles away from your hand, whereas if you jam it up there, it will conflict with the hand there.
I was wondering if it's just a different hand size, because I didn't find that, but that's
because you've trained rapier and you were holding it. So holding it more in line with the forearm extends the hand out more into more of a handshake grip with the tip of the finger over. Now, interestingly, you'll notice that the Spanish rapier has a shorter grip, and one of the reasons is because it gradually became more and more popular in Spain to put two fingers over the guard.
The size of that.
Yeah, and exactly, and the rings are bigger inside correspondingly. So if you put two fingers over, you've now got enough space on the hilt for your remaining two fingers behind there, and it brings your hand more inside the cup, which protects it more and closer to the centre of balance. There's also an issue relating to the guard sizes and shapes and the cross guard around how the swords are held, and it was quite common in Spanish rapier to hold the sword out at arm's length. I won't go into great depths about destreza fencing here because I'm not an expert on it, and I will get someone on who is. But there is a tendency in Spanish rapier to hold the sword more at arm's length like this, and use the cross guards to actually defend against some of the incoming thrusts at the same time as putting in your own thrust. Whereas, I was
going to ask a question actually. Just watching there. All the open work that's here.
Yeah.
That leaves your hand to a thrust, basically exposed. Why didn't they just plate across the top? I know.
Well, so they did. They did.
But why would you just not do it as a matter?
So this is an older design. So they did move to the cup hilt, the true cup hilt, but the true cup hilt doesn't really start to become common until about 1650.
It wouldn't have taken me long to work that out there.
No, although I always say, you know, people, it's the same thing with armour. People always go, oh, there's a gap here and there's a gap there, and it's like, yeah, okay, but there's always a gap somewhere. And even though we could say there is a gap to the hand there, well, there's a gap over my entire body as well, and my back of my hand and my sword arm. So if you do get used pretty quickly. If a point's coming in here, you only have to move the hand a little bit to deflect that or to protect, and you can bait an opponent with that as well. So sometimes, so when we're fencing sabre, sometimes we'll move into cart to tempt the person to hit at the arm here, and as they start to launch their cut, you can catch it early and riposte, so you get ahead of the tempo. So you can use things like that as a fencing kind of
I've done a little bit of Spanish rapier, and that's why I was using this grip here. I should try to show that here. The way I learned is where the index finger goes over the outside here like that. And come on.
Yes. So that's from Thibaut, I guess.
That's Thibaut, yeah. Thibaut holds it like
so
that.
Thibaut, who confusingly is not Spanish, is actually Belgian, I think, or Dutch, and Flemish anyway. And but at the time, Flanders was under Spanish control and influence.
It's still Destreza system, and he has this really interesting stance where like one finger is pointing straight at the ground. It's like super upright and just and then he just kind of walks on. There's a lot of circular movements where you don't do as much like in Italian rapier where there's a lot of disengage back and forth. It's just there's a lot of geometry, of course, where you take a step
and just to confuse matters, there is variation within the Spanish and Spanish influence sources as well. And so I'm working at the moment with Marcelli, who's actually southern Italian, but again within the Spanish influence, and he's from about 1660. And interestingly, he has a whole section where he talks about how to grip the sword, and he tells you all the reasons why you shouldn't put two fingers over the guard and why you should only put one finger over it, despite the fact that he is using Spanish style cup hilt rapiers, which confusingly were very popular in Naples, the Kingdom of Naples, and a lot of Spanish rapiers that you find in museums like the Wallace collection are actually Neapolitan, they're actually Italian, but in the Spanish style. But interestingly, they tend to have longer grips because the Italians preferred putting one finger over. So anyway, so yeah, and just to mention, so I mentioned about holding the sword out in the Spanish style, whereas if we look at English rapier sources, of which there aren't a lot, it has to be said, but if we look at English and French, of which there's a few more, very often the hand is held lower down here, more like most Italian styles. So clearly, if you're holding a sword up here or if you're holding a sword down there, it changes the particular guard design and the way that you're going to hold the sword. So. Right, are you ready to see the final sword for this video? Right, okay, so it is, as Todd correctly guessed, yeah, a small sword. Now, this isn't a completely typical small sword, but I'll hand it to you first. Maybe make a views and then user views from you two. Rather than my views. You know my views on this channel because I talk my views all the time. But
solid silver?
Yep.
So solid silver hilt. So definitely, you know, better quality of workmanship.
Fairly posh.
Fairly posh.
And yet quite easy to make because it's cast. And once you've made the wax and...
I would say only partially cast.
Okay.
Because you can't, as far as I know, they weren't able to get this level of detail into a casting of the time.
That'd be what, chiselled?
Yeah, so what you do is you effectively rough cast it to the right forms, and there'll also be quite a lot of surface texture. So the way we do our lost wax casting now, it's basically the same process, but the finish is always going to be a little bit better because our materials could be finer and things like that. So what you do is you rough cast it to form, you clean it up as best you can, and then you go in with your chisels afterwards. And there's a lot of very fine detail work that couldn't have been cast in. So yes, the workmanship on that is very good, very lovely.
So the grip's very interesting.
The grip is very interesting.
So obviously, for anyone who doesn't know, the grip will be wood underneath, but then it is, rather than wrapped, it's kind of wrapped clad, I would almost describe it.
So that's actually the style of wire binding that I can do quite happily. That's not a problem. So what you've got here are, again, the main twists are in silver, the finer ones are in copper. So you twist up, well, in fact, what they've done here is they've taken two wires, they've twisted them, and then when those two wires have been made a twist, they've taken two pairs of those, and then twisted those. Twisted them in one direction, then they've taken another set of four, twisted the other direction, and then laid them in there with the little tiny copper wires.
Do these have to be annealed when you're doing this to stop it from work hardening?
Well, it depends. So when you talk about silver in the modern age, actually what you're almost always talking about is sterling silver, so 92.5. I don't know what the alloy is on the other percentages, but the other 7.5. But that makes it actually quite hard. But what it does is it makes it a usable alloy for things like jewellery and stuff like that. When you pick up a heavy thing, your ring doesn't deform and turn into an oval. It stays where it is. Right. If you use pure silver, then it barely work hardens at all. It does, but barely work hardens at all. More or less true with the copper as well. But again, because the material doesn't oxidize like steel does, so if you heat up a steel wire, you'll end up with quite a resilient oxidizing surface on it that's quite difficult to remove. With the silver, you can either get rid of it in pickling acid solutions, and the copper. You can get rid of it in acid solutions, or you can clean it off much easier. It's not nearly as deep and resilient as the oxide on steel. So yes, you can anneal, and again, that's what I tend to do, is I do all my twisting and everything, and then I'll anneal it afterwards and then go for it. What is horrible about wire work like this is you have to keep the thing under tension the whole way through. So it does help to have a friend pinning things down and things like that. So although it's a small job and it's like a little bench job, it's actually better done with two people. It also means that once you've stopped, if you decide and you're 3/4 of the way through that actually you need a pee break, or
it's time for a cup of tea,
whatever it is,
if you're English,
18 times a day in English, you can't stop. You have to finish the job.
I should mention this isn't English, this is French. Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, wine breaks 84 times a day.
And that's one of the reasons, just while we're talking about silver, why it doesn't have hallmarks, or at least doesn't have English hallmarks on it. So all sterling silver at this time in England has hallmarks on, which is great because
silver, not just sterling silver, all precious.
Yes, yeah, which is great because we can often tell the exact year that it was made, and very often the city it was made, and very often the exact person who made it. And I have an English small sword where that's the case, and it's dated 1723. This one is probably French. It could be, it's continental anyway, but probably French. But as far as I've found so far, it doesn't have any sort of assay or hallmarks on it. So,
but what is interesting is, so they've done their 4 wire sets, and then they've got a wider band here, little D section, which I think is silver.
I think it is, yeah.
And they've spaced that out. But what they've done here, so they've left the bright of that silver, which they've cleaned back. But that one in there, it's either because they haven't been able to clean it, or they treated it deliberately in the first place to darken it with potassium nitrate or something like that. So you get that black silver contrast. So it's really nicely done, but I can't quite tell if it was deliberately done like that.
Yeah. It's very, when something, so this dates to probably 1720 to 1740, and it's very difficult to tell because obviously patina builds up in that time. But I do get the impression, if you look in the recesses of this, I do get the impression that there was some deliberate blackening of the recesses, in the same way that people still take for granted with modern jewellery. So if you go and buy a piece of silver jewellery, usually it will be black in the recesses and silver on the high points. That's not because it's been left for 50 years to get patina, it's because it's been deliberately done like that, and I think they did do that.
There's a deliberate choice for doing that, is that quite simply it's difficult to clean and polish into the voids. So you end up with a high polish on here and a scrappy, unfinished bottom.
So to speak.
So to speak. Matt's channel. You end up with a scrappy, unfinished
recess. Orifice.
No. And so to solve that problem of having, if you like, a half-finished object, they used to use Niello, I think it is, which is like silver sulfide or something.
I've never known what Niello was, actually.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's relatively easy to make.
Yeah.
And you just put it in as a paste and heat it up.
So just briefly, the blade. So obviously, so small.
Absolutely horrible. To
Yeah. So these are triangular blades.
Lovely blade.
Let me just quickly show the. I mean, I've showed these on my channel lots of times, but so you've essentially got a hollow on this face and then a ridge on this face. So it's a triangular cross section.
And thin.
Yeah, and very, very thin.
Fine work.
Yeah, so each of these surfaces are what we call hollow ground. Literally, they are ground on a wheel. But in addition, this has a broad section at the base, which means it's called a collichemard, okay? Which we maybe can talk about. I have talked about them before, but yeah, so like you say, horrible to make. Why are they horrible to make?
So the edges here, without getting a set of measuring gear on it, the edges here feel to be 1 millimetre thick. So what you've got,
so there's no cutting edge. This is a hollow triangle where obviously you have edges, but the edges aren't sharpened.
Yeah. So I'm going to draw in the air here, so watch out. But you've got the top surface of the blade sort of comes up to a peak like that, and then the bottom side replicates it. At the peak, it is maybe 3 millimetres thick. So you've got the peak here, but as it comes down to the edges, those flanges almost are like 1 millimetre thick. That is incredibly skillful work to do because you can't forge that uniformly. So I think what they would have done, I don't know for sure, but what I think they would have done is to forge this into a die. So you've got a big lump of steel which has got the rough form of this, and you're effectively dragging your blade along it, whacking as you go to form the back there. You're probably going to put in some die punching on the front as well, so you are rough shaping this.
Yes.
But you're not going to get that accuracy. It's the cleanup after that has to be done by hand, has to be done by stones.
So
And that would just take a long time and very skillful work.
So my understanding is they developed the way of making these, and the way that you make this type of blade is the same as how you make a socket bayonet blade. So a bayonet blade is essentially a shorter, thicker version of this. It's a triangular hollow grind. And my understanding is that in the 17th, 18th century, they were pretty much made how you just described, by probably trip hammer dropping down and smacking it into a die one way, then flip it over and do it into another die the other way, and then finish with grinding wheels. However, in the 19th century, because they were still making these sorts of blades, especially for bayonets in the 19th century, they used rollers. And they had enormous steam-powered pressure rollers where the die was on a rolling, like a giant rolling pin, and where you drew the bright orange hot piece of steel through the roller, and that left you with, you know, let's say a sort of 80% finished cross section that was then finished with grinding, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to see how they achieved that. I mean, the technology was, you know, pretty advanced really by those stages. Most of what we can do now in that sort of pressing rolling thing, they could do then, just with different power sources. But it's still, if you did it on a continuous roller, that profile is very, very different to that profile. So if they did it on sort of like a stop-start roller, if you like, where you put it in, you put the roller down, and you start drawing, and the roller has got a variable form in it, which of course they could do. Then yeah, I can see it. But yes, it will always end up with some very, very high quality hand finishing there.
The other way I wondered possibly they could have done it is with a big grinding wheel which has a groove in it, and where you run the blade sort of along the groove in the grinding wheel so that it's grinding two planes at once.
Yeah, I would think not, in the sense of you'd have to dress the wheel, and that'd be quite a big wheel. You'd have to dress it to get that shape, and it wouldn't take too long before
for it to blend
each
out.
one would be slightly different to the next. So a hard steel roller I can see totally, yes. Which is just an automated version of a punch, really. In that sense.
And so if we hand it over to Scal for the handling analysis.
But a lovely little sword.
Yeah, a fairly recent acquisition of mine, that actually. And for anyone who doesn't know, and I do mention this a lot, but in case you don't know, a small sword is called a small sword because it's not a big sword, okay? And this is the default sword when the small sword comes around. So that is called a small sword, not because it's especially small compared to all swords in the world, but because it's smaller than a rapier. And they were also, confusingly, called rapiers. So if you look in Zachary Wilde's treatise of 1711, he frequently says the small sword or rapier. So he's talking about that, but that was regarded as a small rapier. Okay.
Yeah, I've made a futile attempt trying to figure out what's exactly, like, where do you draw a line between a rapier and a small sword? You pretty much can't. There's just, it's a gradient. There's definitely things in between where you're like, okay, this could be either. Depends on how you look at it, because that's throughout history, you always have a very gradual, smooth development. The same way as you didn't have complex hilts right now at first. They were like, okay, let's put a small ring on there, or even a half ring, just something a little bit to protect one finger, and then okay, let's make it 2 rings, let's add some more, etc., etc.
And then there's overlap, and I think what confuses a lot of people is swords like this were still being used in Spain up until the Napoleonic era, which is the same obviously as some of the sabres that we're going to look at in the next video. But therefore these two swords, although I might have dated them slightly differently, absolutely would have been in use at the same time. So if we look at Domenico Angelo's treatise of 1763, he shows how to use your small sword against a Spaniard with a rapier. So they absolutely could have faced, they absolutely could have been used against each other.
And I mean, it is definitely a small sword in the sense of weight. It's
super light.
It feels like nothing.
It's about 400 grams. So it's about the same as a modern foil or épée.
So I would say this is basically, in terms of dueling, this is the height of development as far as precision goes. Because this is all distilled down to what's the least you can get away with to really seriously injure
to still stab each other from some distance.
Well, but that's what that blade profile is all about, is stiffness losing weight.
Yeah.
It's ultra specialized.
But
you can.
But I have to say, so as like when we're dealing antiques, so we put, you know, I sell small swords, but I sell sabers and I sell all these other things. And when we're putting things out on the table, something that's amused me is I think in HEMA or, you know, on YouTube, people look at a sword like this and think it's a toy, think it's a bird spit, think it's a... I'll tell you, of all the swords that we handle regularly that we're most scared of accidentally, you know, wounding ourselves on, it's that. They are like needles, and it's really, when you're bending over, putting stock on a table, getting things out of a box, the worry about getting that in your face is really, really high.
I think you should stop storing them tip up with them.
Might be a good idea, yeah.
But you know, so they are light, they are relatively fragile, but they are lethal little needles.
I mean, I would say for the blade width, they're actually quite sturdy, because they're incredibly narrow, narrower than anything else. And for that, they actually feel fairly solid due to how much this strong ridge here gives it rigidity.
I think it's maximum rigidity and therefore lethality with stabbing.
As stiff as it goes.
versus the weight. And in terms of handling, you know, obviously you've got a reach advantage with something like a rapier, you've got better hand protection, you've got better reach advantage. But in terms of the nimbleness of the point, I mean, that is just super responsive, super quick.
At the same time, you still have a pretty good amount to work with here in terms of parries, because that's quite wide here.
There's nothing delicate about it.
Yeah, it feels strong.
No, I mean, it's delicate by there, but, but up to here, nice and resilient.
And you're defending with this part of the blade. You know, you shouldn't really. Okay, you sometimes deflect with the tip, but usually you're parrying with the base of the blade. And you've got to remember that these kolishmads, these broad blades, are earlier small swords, so they are in the period when you might come up against someone with one of these, or even something, you know, like a Walloon broadsword or something like this. So having a bit more beef at the base of your blades useful in that period. Later on, when those other swords are less of a worry for the small sword wearer, then that goes away and we just have a narrow blade all the way down.
Looking at this, I can't help but think, you know, this myth of the blood groove and everything, which obviously you don't need, but if anything, that's one hell of a groove. I mean,
that's to release the vacuum from the person's body.
I mean, this looks like
that's what the internet told me.
I thought it was to release their bad vibe.
I mean,
that's more believable.
As a side effect, it'll do that. This is like a canal. So yeah, you could definitely, if you stabbed something squishy with it, I think liquid might run down it. But it's not actually a functional feature as such.
Although it's funny that in various languages, I think in Swedish, what they call the fuller in a blade does translate as blood groove. So it's not just English speakers that are guilty of that.
But yeah, in terms of handling, I mean, it doesn't get lighter than this. It doesn't get more agile. And I suppose this is really just a gentleman's sword in the sense that you do little pokes and you don't mangle the opponent. You can absolutely deliver highly lethal thrusts that would be very difficult to treat and survive. And this would go through a head quite easily.
And clothing, anything like it's not there.
But you wouldn't leave behind a totally mangled body.
But I mean, even regular mail, you're going to get 2 or 3.
Easy. And you know, and it's quite macabre, obviously, to mention this, but people look at a big old broad saber or something like that, and they think, oh, it looks such a big, strong, powerful weapon. But you try cutting through a tatami mat which has got clothes on it with one of those sabers. Far more difficult than most people realise. Now you take a small sword and poke it, it'll go straight through. Straight, almost no resistance. So to finish off, for this video.
This was a 10-minute film, man.
Yeah, I know. Well, you know, it's the 3 of us in one video. It was never going to be quick, was it?
The magic of editing.
So out of these 3 swords, if you pick up that one again, Scout, out of these 3 swords, which one would you each choose for a fight? If you had to fight it, in the afternoon today, which one would you pick?
Well, I'll go for longer.
So that's the longest one.
Okay, but I don't like that one. Spaniards, they knew what they're doing.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Which one would you choose, Scal?
You can have this one. You'll fight me for it. Oh, you got dicky right arm at the moment, haven't you? Brilliant.
Yeah, but he's holding
in that case,
with his left hand. That's ambidextrous. That's
I mean, I think I also want to say that there's, I said this one is just slightly more nimble, and you can theoretically cut with it. Looking at that, I wouldn't have much confidence in it. I don't think yeah, you can try cutting, but I don't think it would do a whole lot, and it wouldn't have that much stopping power. Neither do thrusts, in all fairness, but I feel like you might as well just commit to the thrust. And I'm thinking that I wouldn't think this is at a big advantage, really, a disadvantage compared to that, but
then a lot less hand
I feel
protection.
like you just don't have the blade presence here, so
Yeah.
it might be pretty easy to bind
Yeah.
with the rapier, and you can disengage well, so
you're picking the Spanish rapier? Probably. But what would
I could actually, funnily enough, I could actually imagine going with this, but I think I would also pick the Spanish rapier, yeah.
Interesting, right. So the Spanish rapier is very popular. Which one would I choose? Do you know, so I do fence rapier and I do fence small sword. Some people believe that small swords are superior to rapiers, and there are a couple of French small sword treatises that argue that that's the case. Of course, they were French small sword masters arguing that that was the case. Personally, no. I think extra reach is always an advantage, but I also like cutting capacity. So while I was going to pick the Spanish rapier, I think I'd actually pick the English rapier, not for patriotic reasons, but for two reasons. One, it is slightly longer, only very slightly. It is slightly longer, but because it's got that cutting capacity. And I really like the ability of being able to come down at someone's inner leg or across their face with a cut. And so, because I think that this will still give a pretty nasty gash out towards here, whereas the Spanish rapier won't, although I do prefer the hand protection of the Spanish rapier, I would take this because I just think it's a more advantageous blade.
I would usually agree. I think my concern with this is just, I'm not sure how well it comes across on camera, but the blade seems somewhat flimsy just because it's so thin and it is so narrow.
Yeah, I agree.
I would be concerned about getting it damaged against.
I completely agree, and also the hand protection, definitely this pierced cup is more likely to get pierced through by an opponent's blade.
I don't think it'd actually take much to go through that.
No, whereas this is quite sturdy steel, so it's a close.
I like how that one handles.
It's a close run thing, but none of us picked the small sword. What would you pick, I think? So comment down below, which of these three swords would you pick if you had to have a fight later on today?
I'd also like to point out that if this theoretical fight was between myself and Matt, he would be better armed than me if he had spectacles and I had a shotgun. So,
but you might have your trebuchet.
I might have my trebuchet. I would be such a guaranteed loss. Don't ever put money on me for this sort of thing.
Just conceal a Balestrino crossbow, just quickly whip out and shoot him in the leg.
And he'll go, oh, that smarted a bit.
Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, guys, and obviously thanks to Skal and Todd for joining me for this video. There is going to be a part 2 to this really soon, where we're going to look at some later period swords, probably more concisely than we did in this, but these are three really interesting swords, and I think that small swords and rapiers don't get enough attention in sword related videos online, because these were really important sword types in the history of swords globally, actually, not just in Europe, but of course South America, Asia. Rapier blades were even used in India as well, so I think super important swords to look at, and hopefully we'll look at similar ones in the future. Anyway, Skal, thank you. Todd, thank you, and
Thank you.
see you back really soon. Cheers, folks.